Pay attention to this. Qasr al-Bahar. Elevator 4. 11:47 p.m. A woman in a red dress steps in. She is not alone. The man beside her is not her husband. Her husband is 31 floors above them. Asleep, trusting, completely certain about who his wife is, where she is going, and what kind of woman he married 4 months ago at a private ceremony with close family and fresh flowers he chose himself. The man beside her is not a stranger she met in Dubai. He is not a chance encounter at the hotel bar. He is the son of her husband's business partner of 22 years, a man who has known her husband since before either of them had anything worth protecting. He leans close. He says something. She laughs. He touches her face with one hand and she does not pull back. She lets him. The elevator doors close. They ride down together. 41 minutes later she rides back up alone and the camera records her face both times, and those two faces belong to two entirely different women. The woman who laughed on the way down does not come back. What comes back is something quieter and colder and already decided. A woman staring at elevator doors that haven't opened yet, hands at her sides, completely still. At 12:44 a.m. her husband goes over the balcony of room 3112. 31 floors. The official report will call it an accident. A healthy man on his honeymoon. An open balcony. No witnesses. No signs of struggle. Case moving toward closure within 48 hours. But elevator 4 runs on a separate closed-circuit system. A backup recording unit installed during a 2019 security upgrade, stored locally on a hard drive inside the elevator shaft housing, invisible to anyone monitoring the main hotel surveillance network. Not connected remotely. Not on Zayed's list of things to disable. He had planned everything. He had paid for a blind spot in the corridor cameras. He had thought of the IT subcontractor, the fraudulent passport, the shell company, the 14 months of preparation. He had not thought about elevator 4. One camera he didn't know existed recorded everything. And what it captured didn't just catch a wife with another man. It caught a murder built across 14 months, 2 countries, 8 million euros, and a business dispute that a 31-year-old man decided could only be resolved one way. The husband knew all of it before he boarded the plane. That is the part of this story that changes everything. Everyone who heard about this case asked the same question. How does a healthy 54-year-old man fall from a 31st floor balcony on his honeymoon at the Qasr al-Bahar? That was the wrong question. The right question, the one nobody thought to ask until elevator 4 made them, was who was staying 2 floors below that room. How long he had been planning to be there. And why the man on the 31st floor, who already knew the answer to both of those questions, had boarded the plane to Dubai anyway, unpacked his luggage, ordered flowers for the dinner table, and sat across from his wife watching her smile at him without saying a word about any of it. Hamad al-Suwaidi, 54 years old, Emirati, born in Sharjah to a family with no inherited wealth, no government contracts passed down through a name, no floor beneath them if something went wrong. His father worked in a municipal office. His mother raised 4 children in an apartment that smelled of cardamom and cooking gas and the specific quiet of a household where money was managed rather than spent. Hamad watched that management his entire childhood. He understood what it produced, stability without momentum, survival without assent, and he decided before he was 20 that he would build something different, and that he would build it himself, and that the only way to do that was to understand the mechanics of the thing so completely that no one could ever take it from him by knowing more than he did. He worked shipping administration for a larger freight firm for 6 years after university. He was not an impressive hire on paper. He was not fast-tracked. He was paid adequately and promoted slowly, and the company never fully understood what was sitting at one of its middle desks, learning every system, mapping every inefficiency, building a picture of exactly where the real money moved and how it moved and what it would cost to intercept a small portion of that movement for himself. When he had saved 85,000 dirhams, he left. He leased a single freight container at Jebel Ali port in 1996. He worked 18-hour days. He made expensive mistakes and did not make them twice. By 2001, he had 4 containers, a company registration, and a business partner named Tariq al-Rashidi, a man he had met through the freight industry who brought operational knowledge and a family name with existing relationships in the Kuwaiti market. Together they built something that neither of them could have built separately. That collaboration would 22 years later, produced the circumstances that killed Hamad. By 2024, Al-Suwaidi Logistics employed 1,200 people. Government freight contracts across 4 Gulf states. A declared asset value of 340 million dirhams that his accountants privately described as conservative. His name appeared in Gulf business publications as an example of what first-generation wealth creation looked like when it was done with patience and precision rather than leverage and luck. He was interviewed once for a profile piece and said one thing that the journalist quoted at the top of the article: "I never borrowed what I could earn and I never trusted what I couldn't verify." The journalist thought it was a line about business. It was a line about everything. His friends described him 3 ways: direct, generous, and stubborn, in a manner that only made sense when you understood that everything he had ever owned had been built against resistance of one kind or another. He was not a man who accepted no. He was not a man who adjusted course because the weather changed. He was not a man who managed problems from a distance. He went toward them, every single time. His colleagues called this his greatest professional quality. It was, in the end, the quality that placed him on that balcony. Because when Hamad al-Suwaidi discovered that something was wrong, truly, structurally, dangerously wrong, he did not retreat. He went toward it, even when going toward it meant Dubai. Even when going toward it meant the Qasr al-Bahar. Even when going toward it meant a 31st floor room with a balcony and a wife who had been placed in his life to stand near that balcony on a specific night. His first wife Maryam died of cancer in 2021 after 11 years of marriage. They had no children. That detail is not a footnote in this story. It is the architectural foundation of the entire murder plan. Without children, under the terms of Hamad's estate as his lawyers had structured it, everything passed to a surviving spouse. The company, the assets, the government contracts, the controlling stake, the 340 million dirhams. Every dirham of it to whoever was married to him when he died. The people who built this plan knew that before they chose the woman, before they chose the city, before they chose anything, the absence of children was the reason the plan was possible. It was the door they walked through. Everything else, the matchmaking network, the placement, the coaching, the 14 months of preparation, everything else was just the mechanism. The no children clause was the motive, the method, and the map. After Maryam died, Hamad built a wall. Not a visible one. Not the kind that people recognize and gather around and treat with gentle concern. A quiet one. He returned to the office the week after the funeral. He worked. His family stopped inviting him to dinners he never attended. His friends stopped suggesting women he never called. He attended the events that were professional obligations and declined everything else with a politeness that communicated, without being rude about it, that the door to his personal life had closed and he was not currently accepting visitors. For 3 years, the only version of Hamad al-Suwaidi that anyone received was the version that existed in freight terminals and boardrooms and the backseats of cars between one meeting and the next. He was not broken. He was not visibly grieving in the way people expect grief to look. He was resolved. He had decided, privately, without announcement, that the remaining years of his life would be professional rather than personal, and he had made that decision with the same finality he brought to every decision, and he had kept it for 3 years without deviation. That is what makes the charity gala in February significant. Not the event itself, a fundraising function for a regional humanitarian organization, 300 attendees, a downtown Dubai hotel ballroom, the kind of event Hamad attended twice a month and left early. What makes it significant is that a man who had kept a door closed for 3 years walked in and, within 90 minutes, found it open. And he had not seen it happen. He had simply been standing in a room talking to someone who asked him the right question, and by the time he noticed the door was open, she was already standing inside it. Her name was Natasha. She did not approach him. That was the first thing he registered without registering it. That everyone at events like this positioned themselves, calculated the approach, waited for the window. She was at the far end of the room with a glass of water, not wine, talking to someone from a humanitarian organization's UAE office, and she looked like a woman who was actually listening rather than managing her exit from the conversation. He moved toward her. He initiated. He asked what brought her to the event. She gave him a real answer. And then she asked him one question, a specific, intelligent question about cold chain transport logistics across the Kuwait-Saudi land corridor in summer, a question that revealed she had actually listened to something he had said publicly 8 months earlier and had found it interesting enough to think about further. He answered it. She asked to follow up. He answered that. 40 minutes passed and he had not noticed. He told a friend the following week that she made him feel chosen. Not complimented, chosen. After 3 years of rooms full of people who wanted access to his name or his contracts or his network, a woman had sat across from him and appeared to want access only to what he actually thought about things. The friend said he sounded like a teenager. Hamad said he was aware of that. He saw her again the following week. And the week after. For months after the gala they were married. Small ceremony. Close family only. The flowers on the table were ones he had ordered himself. He had no idea that every moment of those 4 months had been designed before they met. That the question about cold chain logistics had been selected from a briefing document. That the glass of water instead of wine, the position at the far end of the room, the way she listened, the way she laughed, the specific cadence of every conversation they had during those 4 months. All of it had been built by someone else and handed to her before she walked through the door. He had no idea. Until he did. This is who Natasha Volkov was on paper. 29 years old. Ukrainian. Hospitality coordinator at the Waldorf Astoria Ras Al Khaimah. Fluent in 4 languages, Ukrainian, Russian, English, and conversational Arabic that she had spent 18 months developing with deliberate precision because she had been told it would be necessary. No criminal record. No outstanding debts. No history of fraud, deception, or any other category of concern that a background check was designed to surface. Professional references from her Kyiv employment that confirmed she was diligent, warm with guests, discreet about client information, and the kind of employee who remembered details about the people she worked with. Every colleague at the Waldorf who was later interviewed said a version of the same thing, with the same tone of admiring certainty. She was clearly meant for something larger than conference room bookings and event coordination. She had the kind of presence that belonged in rooms with more at stake. They were not wrong about that. They had simply never imagined how much larger, or what the stakes would turn out to be, or what presence in those rooms would actually cost. She grew up in Kharkiv in a Soviet-era apartment building with thin walls and neighbors whose arguments you learned to sleep through, and a father who came home from construction sites smelling of concrete dust, and a mother who worked hospital administration with the specific efficiency of someone who has understood since early adulthood that no one is coming to simplify things for you. Natasha was her parents' only child. She watched her mother manage the household budget with the precision of someone performing surgery, and she watched her father work himself into a tiredness that had no recovery day, and she decided, not dramatically, not in a moment she could later identify, but gradually and completely, that she would not live the version of life that asked everything of you and gave back just enough. She was going to find the larger room. She just needed to find the door. She studied hospitality management at a Kyiv university on a partial scholarship. She graduated near the top of her program. She worked 2 years at a luxury property in Kyiv, learning the specific grammar of how wealthy people moved through spaces and what they needed from the people serving them, which was not service exactly, but a particular quality of invisibility that made them feel seen. She was good at it. She saved carefully. She registered with 3 recruitment firms. When the position at the Waldorf Ras Al Khaimah came through in early 2021, she accepted it within 48 hours. That is the version that exists in every official document. Background check cleared. Employment history verified through 2 independent confirmation calls. References provided and confirmed. Recruitment pathway logged and processed. Every procedural box ticked with the patience of something that had been carefully constructed to withstand scrutiny. What the official record contains no trace of, what no background check could surface because it had been designed specifically to leave nothing to surface, is the dinner in Kyiv in March 2021. A restaurant near the Podol district. A corner table booked under a name that was not the name of the man who sat at it. A meal that lasted 3 hours and was paid for in cash. A conversation that began with a man placing a phone face down on the table and saying, without preamble, that he was going to tell her what he needed and she could say no and walk away and they would never speak again, or she could listen to all of it and then decide. She listened to all of it. The man was Zayed al-Rashidi, 31 years old, the only son of Tariq al-Rashidi, Hamad's business partner of 22 years. He had flown in from Dubai that morning and he would fly back the next morning and the trip would appear in no record connected to his name. He was careful in the way that people are careful when they have been planning something long enough to have already identified every mistake. He told Natasha she would receive 8 million euros. Half on the wedding day, half on completion. He used the word completion. He did not elaborate on what completion meant. He moved past it with the momentum of a man presenting a business case to someone he expected to ask questions about the margins, not the exit terms. Natasha later claimed she understood completion to mean the marriage, the inheritance, the legal transfer of assets following a natural death at some unspecified future point. The prosecution later spent 3 sessions demonstrating why the word natural appeared nowhere in anything Zayed had ever written to her. She asked him one question at the end of the dinner. How old? He said 54. She was quiet for a moment. One moment, not long, not the pause of someone working through a moral calculation, the shorter pause of someone confirming that the number matched a threshold they had already set privately. Then she said yes. And the dinner ended. And she flew to Ras Al Khaimah 6 weeks later with a suitcase and a work visa and a briefing document on her phone that she deleted every time she finished reading a section and rewrote from memory into a personal notebook that she kept in a locked toiletry case in her apartment. What Zayed built over the following 8 months was not a cover story. Cover stories are simple, one layer designed to answer one question. What Zayed built was a person. A version of Natasha that had existed in the margins of Hamad's professional world before she ever moved to the center of it, that had a verifiable employment history at a property he occasionally used for corporate events, that had a presence and a professional reputation that would survive any inquiry his lawyers or his family might conduct before or after the wedding. He was not preparing her for a conversation. He was preparing her for a relationship that had to hold under the weight of a man who had spent 30 years trusting only what he could verify. The coaching messages recovered later by investigators number over 200. They span 8 months and they read, the forensic analyst noted in her report, less like messages between partners in a scheme and more like detailed performance notes between a director and an actor who is preparing for a role that has no closing night. What to wear to the gala? Not a color suggestion. A specific dress with a specific silhouette chosen because Hamad's late wife Miriam had favored a similar cut, and the subliminal familiarity would register as comfort before it registered as attraction. Where to position herself in the room, far end, near the humanitarian organization's representatives, because Hamad consistently gravitated toward people who appeared to be there for a reason rather than a network. The glass of water instead of wine, because Miriam had not drunk alcohol and Hamad associated sobriety at functions with seriousness and self-possession. The cold chain question, selected because Hamad had raised the Kuwait-Saudi corridor problem at an industry conference 8 months earlier, it was documented in a trade publication, and Zayed had annotated his forwarded copy with 6 words. He will talk for an hour. Every detail had a source. Every choice had a calculation behind it. The woman Hamad believed he had discovered on his own, standing at the far end of that ballroom, genuinely listening, asking the one question that reached him after 3 years of closed doors. That woman had been assembled, positioned, and rehearsed before she ever walked through the door. The night before the gala, Zayed sent her one final message that the prosecution would later describe as the most revealing document in the entire recovered record. More revealing than the payment transfer, more revealing than the elevator audio, more revealing because it showed not the mechanics of the plan but its author's precise understanding of the man he was targeting. Make him feel chosen. Men like Hamad have been flattered their entire lives. Since the first dirham, the first contract, the first magazine profile. Everybody wants something from him. Nobody ever made him feel chosen. That is the only difference between this working and this failing. Everything else I have already given you. Walk in. Find him. Make him feel chosen. She walked in. She found him. She made him feel chosen within the first hour. And the awful, irreducible truth of it is that whatever she was performing, whatever had been scripted and rehearsed and calculated, the feeling it produced in Hamad was real. The door that had been closed for 3 years opened. Not because he was foolish. Not because grief had made him careless. Because she was extraordinarily good at what she had been prepared to do, and because the man she was doing it to had spent 3 years waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for exactly the thing she had been coached to give him. For months later she was standing at an altar next to a man who had built everything he owned with his own hands and trusted almost nothing he could not verify, and he had verified her. He had checked. His lawyers had checked. Everything came back clean. because everything had been designed to come back clean. What no check had found, and what Hamad would not find for another 3 weeks, was the dinner in Kiev. The €400,000 preparation payment. The 200 coaching messages. The man with the fraudulent passport who was already planning, from the moment the wedding invitation was printed, which room he would book at the Qasr al-Bahar and how far below the 31st floor he would need to be. To understand why any of this happened, you have to understand one thing first. Zayed al-Rashidi had not been stolen from. Nobody had taken anything from him by force, by fraud, by deception, or by any mechanism that the law recognized as injury. What had happened to Zayed was something quieter and in certain ways more maddening than theft. He had been corrected. A document he had never read closely enough had been read closely by someone else's lawyers, and that reading had produced a legal outcome that was entirely within the rights of the man who commissioned it, and Zayed had sat across from 3 separate arbitration panels over 14 months and heard 3 separate sets of lawyers tell him the same thing in different words. You were promised something that was never actually yours to be promised, and the man who promised it to you was your father, and your father did not have the authority to promise it, and there is nothing here to adjudicate. Go home. He did not go home. He went to Kiev. Zayed al-Rashidi, 31 years old, the only son of Tariq al-Rashidi, who had built his half of al-Suwaidi logistics from the same starting point as Hamad, the same Jebel Ali freight world, the same early 2000s Gulf economy, the same combination of relationship capital and operational knowledge that turned a small partnership into a significant company over 2 decades of shared risk. Tariq was not a passive partner. He had contributed. He had brought the Kuwaiti relationships that opened the first government contract. He had managed the Northern Gulf operations while Hamad built the financial architecture in Dubai. They had, for 22 years, functioned as the kind of business partnership that people in the Gulf freight industry pointed to as the model, complementary, stable, built on a handshake that had never needed to become a dispute because both men had always found their way to the same conclusion before it escalated. Until the restructuring. Hamad made the decision to restructure al-Suwaidi Logistics in 2022. He was not reckless about it, and he was not cruel about it, and he did not make it out of animosity toward Tariq or any desire to diminish what Tariq had contributed. He made it because the company had grown to a scale where the original 2001 partnership structure, written when they had 4 containers and a Sharjah office and no government contracts, was no longer the right architecture for an entity with 1,200 employees and obligations across 4 Gulf states. He engaged lawyers. They reviewed the original agreement. They found what they found. The restructuring was Hamad's right under every clause that mattered. He exercised it. The new holding entity centralized control. The Rashidi family retained a minority stake with consultancy designation. Tariq fought it. He fought it the way men of his generation fought things, through channels, through relationships, through the assumption that 22 years of shared history created an obligation that superseded whatever a document said. He called in every relationship he had. He went to 3 rounds of arbitration. He lost 3 times. Every lawyer who looked at the 2001 agreement said the same thing. Hamad is correct. The restructuring proceeds. There is nothing here. Tariq absorbed this with the resignation of a man who was 63 years old and had enough to live on and had, somewhere in the 3rd arbitration loss, decided that the fight was costing him more than the outcome was worth. He was angry. He felt betrayed. But he was done. Zayed was not done. Zayed had grown up understanding that his inheritance was not just money. It was position. It was the Rashidi name on a significant company. It was the specific kind of standing in Dubai's business community that came from being the heir to something built rather than simply the recipient of something given. He had built his entire sense of his own future around that inheritance with the confidence of someone who had never been given a reason to question it. His father had told him since he was a child that one day al-Suwaidi Logistics would have 2 names on it and one of those names was theirs. He had made decisions based on that future. He had declined other opportunities. He had positioned himself, professionally and socially, as a man who was waiting for something rather than building something, and the waiting had made sense because the thing he was waiting for was real and certain and legally secured. And then it wasn't. The restructuring documents reduced him to the son of a minority consultant in a company he had been told was partly his. Not by law. He understood by the 3rd arbitration that the law had nothing for him. but by the logic of what 22 years of partnership should have meant. By the logic of what his father had promised him. By the logic of a future that had been assembled in his mind over 30 years, and that a single legal review had dismantled in 30 days. He tried the legitimate approach first. He engaged his own lawyers separately from his father's. He looked for angles the arbitration panels had missed. He found none. He requested a meeting with Hamad directly. Hamad took the meeting. He was polite. He was immovable. He expressed genuine respect for Tariq's contribution and genuine regret that the outcome was painful and genuine certainty that the restructuring was correct and would proceed. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. It ended with a handshake. Zayed drove home understanding for the first time that there was no version of the legitimate approach that led anywhere other than acceptance. He was not built for acceptance. He had never been required to practice it. He sat with it for 3 months. He did not make impulsive decisions. That is one of the things that made him genuinely dangerous rather than merely reckless. He thought. He mapped. He found the one structural reality in Hamad's situation that the lawyers and the arbitration panels and the restructuring documents had not touched and could not touch. Hamad had no children. His estate, under the existing will structure, passed to a surviving spouse. All of it. The 340 million dirhams. The controlling stake. The government contracts. The company that had just been legally confirmed as Hamad's alone. If Hamad died married, without having finalized the restructuring documents, which required Hamad's signature on a new set of agreements that his lawyers had been preparing for months, the estate transferred. The company froze in legal proceedings. The minority stake that the restructuring had assigned to the Rashidi family suddenly became a point of negotiation in an inheritance dispute rather than a settled legal matter. Everything Zayed had lost through 3 arbitration panels could be recovered through one widow. He just needed the right widow. He spent 2 months identifying the network, a discrete service operating through private referrals that existed in the specific overlap between wealthy Gulf families and young women from Eastern Europe and Central Asia who understood the mathematics of proximity to significant money. He was methodical about it. He interviewed 3 women before he flew to Kiev. He chose Natasha because of one thing she said when he described the man she would be meeting. She said, "Tell me what he lost and I will show you what he needs." He recognized that as a professional's answer. He booked the flight. The dinner near Podol lasted 3 hours. He was direct. He laid out the structure of the arrangement with the clarity of a man presenting a business case, because that is precisely what he understood it to be. 8 million euros. Half on the wedding day. Half on completion. He told her who Hamad was. He told her about Maryam. He told her about the grief and the wall and the 3 years of professional isolation. He told her what reaching a man like Hamad required, not flattery, not beauty, not the performance of availability, but the specific sensation of being chosen by someone who appeared to need nothing from him. He told her that everything else he would provide. The background, the placement, the preparation. All she needed to bring was the quality that could not be scripted. The ability to make a man who had been alone for 3 years feel like the loneliness was over. She asked one question. He answered it. She said yes. What followed was 6 weeks of preparation before she left for Ras Al Khaimah and 8 months of positioning before the gala. Zayed was thorough in a way that the investigation would later find almost methodical to the point of self-incrimination, not because he was careless, but because the volume of communication required to build a real person rather than a cover story meant 200 messages, and 200 messages leave 200 pieces of evidence for a forensic analyst to catalog. He coached her on Hamad's professional habits, his social patterns, his relationship with silence, the specific topics that opened him and the specific approaches that would make him feel managed rather than reached. He chose the dress. He chose the position in the room. He selected the cold chain question from a trade publication and annotated it with a single line. He told her about the glass of water. He did not tell her about the restructuring deadline. That detail, the unsigned documents, the ticking legal clock, the specific urgency that would eventually produce the 2:34 a.m. message. He held back. Because telling her there was a deadline was telling her there was a reason for speed, and a reason for speed was a reason to ask questions about what happened after the speed ran out, and Natasha asking that question clearly and early was the one variable Zayed could not afford. So he managed the timeline himself and gave her only what she needed for each phase and told her, when she pressed him about the long-term structure of the plan, that there would be time and that everything would become clear and that her only responsibility was the next step in front of her. There was not, in the end, time. The restructuring documents were still unsigned when the honeymoon was booked. Hamad was stalling, for reasons that Zayed attributed to legal caution and that may, in retrospect, have had nothing to do with legal caution at all. The window was closing. Zayed booked a flight to Dubai. He paid 20,000 dirhams in cash to a hotel IT subcontractor to make himself unavailable for one night. He reserved a room under a fraudulent name on the 29th floor. He had thought of almost everything. He had not thought about elevator 4. 3 weeks after the wedding, a plain envelope arrived at Hamad's office on a Tuesday morning. No return address, no company name, no identifying mark of any kind on the outside. Hand-delivered to the reception desk by a courier who paid cash, gave a false name to the receptionist who asked, and was gone before anyone thought to check whether the building's entrance camera had caught a clear image of his face. It had. It would later matter. But on that Tuesday morning, all that mattered was what was inside. One photograph, printed on standard paper, not photograph stock. The kind of print that comes from an office printer, deliberate in its plainness, as if whoever sent it understood that the information was sufficient and decoration would only distract from it. The photograph showed 2 people standing outside a restaurant. A woman and a man. The woman was Natasha. The man was Zayed al-Rashidi. They were not touching. They were standing the way people stand when they know each other well enough that proximity requires no justification. The timestamp embedded in the digital file's metadata, recovered later when investigators processed the original, read 14 months before the charity gala. Hamad looked at that photograph alone in his office for a long time. He did not call Natasha. He did not call Zayed. He did not call his family or his lawyer or his closest friend or anyone whose first instinct would have been to tell him what to do next. He sat behind his desk and he looked at the photograph and he did what he had done at every significant juncture of his professional life when the information in front of him was severe enough to demand precision rather than reaction. He was quiet, he thought, and then he called a man named Khalid Baser. Khalid Baser, 51 years old. Former financial crimes analyst with Interpol's Dubai liaison office. Retired after 16 years into private practice at a firm based in the Dubai International Financial Center. A man of specific reputation in the narrow world of Gulf corporate intelligence. Not famous, not publicly visible, known only to the category of person who needed the kind of work he did and knew better than to advertise that they needed it. Hamad had used him twice before. Once when a supply chain partner in the Northern Gulf was falsifying container manifests and skimming the differential. Once when a subcontractor on a government freight tender was billing for equipment that had never been deployed. Both times Khalid had found what Hamad suspected was there and delivered the evidence in a format that held up to legal scrutiny. Both times he had done it quietly and never spoken about it to anyone. Hamad told him one sentence. Find everything. He did not say about what. Khalid looked at the photograph Hamad slid across the desk and he said he understood and he did not ask further questions and he left. What came back over the following 3 weeks was delivered on a Tuesday evening at 11 p.m. in a gray folder that Hamad received in his office with the door closed and the lights low and his phone face down on the desk. Khalid placed it on the table and sat in the chair across from him and did not speak while Hamad read because he had learned over 20 years of this work that there was a specific quality of silence required when you handed someone information that was going to change the shape of their life, and that the worst thing you could do in that silence was fill it. The folder was organized chronologically. It began with the matchmaking network, a documented trail from Zayed's inquiries through a private referral service to a series of communications with intermediaries across 3 countries, ending in a confirmed meeting in Kyiv in March 2021. It continued with the financial record, a wire transfer of 400,000 euros from a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands to a bank account in Lithuania held in Natasha's maiden name. The transfer was dated 7 days before the charity gala. Not the 8 million. Preparation payment. Proof of intent before a single conversation with Hamad had occurred. Money that had moved before she walked into that ballroom, before she asked the cold chain question, before she made him feel chosen. The coaching messages came next. Printed in chronological order. over 200 of them across 8 months. Zayed's instructions on what to wear and where to stand and how to frame the first question and how to hold the silence that came after. The specific targeting of Miriam's memory. Hamad's grief used as the entry point. His loneliness used as the lever. His 3 years of closed doors used as the door to walk through. Reading them was reading the architecture of every moment he had believed was real. The gala, the first dinner, the walks along the waterfront in Ras Al Khaimah, where he had told her things he had not told anyone in 3 years. The moment 6 weeks in, when he had looked at her across a table and thought for the first time since Miriam that the remaining chapter of his life might be personal as well as professional. All of it mapped, sourced, annotated, built by someone else and handed to her before any of it happened. He read those messages for a long time. Then he reached the final document in the folder. A single page. A message sent from Zayed's recovered communication channel at 2:34 a.m., 11 days before the honeymoon booking was confirmed. The restructuring documents are still unsigned. He is stalling. I believe he suspects something. If those documents get signed before we act, the will structure changes and everything we have built means nothing. It has to happen in Dubai. During the trip. There is no other window. You know what I am asking. You have always known what this required. Natasha's reply. 40 minutes later. You told me there would be time. You told me this would be different. Zayed's response. 5 words. There is no more time. Hamad set the page down on the desk. He did not read it again. He had the kind of mind that retained things. Completely on a single reading, it was part of what had made him exceptional at the freight business, the ability to read a contract once and hold every clause, and he did not need to read it again to understand what it said. He understood what it said before he finished the first sentence. He sat in the dark office for a long time after Khalid left. And then he did something that nobody who knew him, not Khalid, not his lawyer, not his closest friend who had known him since the Jebel Ali days, would have predicted if they had been told what was in that folder. He did not call the police. He did not call his lawyer. He did not confront Natasha. He did not call Zayed. He did not cancel the honeymoon that had been booked for the Qasr Al Bahar 4 nights, room 3112, 31st floor, the trip that his wife had suggested and that he had confirmed, and that was, according to the document he had just finished reading, the window in which the man who had built this plan intended for him to die. He booked a car to the airport instead. For the correct date. For the honeymoon. The decision has been examined from every angle by everyone who subsequently learned of it, and the honest answer is that Hamad al-Suwaidi never explained it in writing, and so the explanation has to be constructed from what is known about the man rather than from what he left behind. Several interpretations exist. Perhaps he needed to confirm it with his own eyes before he acted, to see the deception functioning in real time, to sit across the dinner table from his wife and watch her perform love for a man she had been paid to kill and know, with the certainty that only direct experience provides, that the folder was not a misunderstanding or a coincidence or a setup of its own design. Perhaps after 3 years of closed doors and then 4 months of what he had believed was something real, the folder told him something he was not yet ready to act on without first understanding it completely. Perhaps he was, at 54 years old and after everything he had built and lost and built again, simply unwilling to let anyone else choose how his story ended. Or perhaps, and this is the interpretation that Detective Al-Muhari would return to repeatedly in the months that followed, Hamad was the most controlled person in this entire story from the moment he saw that photograph, and the honeymoon was not recklessness and not resignation and not a death wish. It was strategy, because a man who went to Dubai knowing what was waiting for him, and who went anyway, was also a man who had time to make arrangements before he went. He called Khalid back into his office the following morning. He instructed him to prepare a sealed document. Every piece of evidence in the gray folder, the matchmaking trail, the payment records, the coaching messages, the 2:34 a.m. message, and Natasha's reply. Organized, notarized, signed, dated, prepared in duplicate. 1 copy addressed to the Dubai Public Prosecution. 1 copy addressed to Hamad's personal lawyer with instructions for immediate delivery. Both copies to be held by Khalid in a secured location and released simultaneously under one condition. If Hamad did not call Khalid personally before 8 a.m. on November 4th, the documents would be delivered automatically. No confirmation required. No second authorization. The absence of a phone call was itself the instruction. He told Khalid nothing else about what he was planning to do with the information or why he was not going to the police directly. Khalid, who had known Hamad long enough to understand when a question would not receive an answer, did not ask. Hamad went home. He packed a suitcase with the care of a man who packed for business travel twice a month, efficiently without sentiment. He flew to Dubai with his wife. He checked them into the Qasr al-Bahar. He ordered flowers for the dinner table. He sat across from Natasha in a restaurant with views across the Gulf, and he watched her smile at him, and he said nothing about the gray folder and nothing about Kiev and nothing about 2:34 a.m. messages and 5 words that meant he was supposed to be dead before November 4th. He was giving her something. What exactly he was giving her? A final chance to be something other than what the folder said she was, or a confirmation he needed to see with his own eyes, or simply the last hours of a life spent looking at things directly rather than managing them from a distance, is something only he knew and he did not come back to say. What he left behind instead was a sealed envelope in Khalid Baser's office. Every piece of evidence. Notarized and dated 3 days before they flew to Dubai. A dead man's case file, pre-assembled, waiting for the phone that would not ring at 8 a.m. on November 4th. Hamad al-Suwaidi had spent 30 years building things that would outlast the difficulty of making them. The gray folder was the last thing he built. He built it knowing he might not come back. He built it the same way he had built everything else, with precision, without panic, and with the absolute certainty that if the work was done correctly it would hold. It held. November 3rd. The Qasr al-Bahar. And everything that the camera saw. The day itself was unremarkable in the way that final days often are, ordinary in every surface detail, carrying nothing visible that would allow anyone standing inside it to understand what it was. Hamad and Natasha had breakfast on their suite's private terrace overlooking the Gulf. The water was the color it gets in November when the summer heat has finally released its grip on the air and everything clarifies. Deep, sharp, the kind of blue that makes Dubai look like a promise kept. They ate. They talked. A hotel staff member who served them that morning later told investigators that the man seemed quiet but not unhappy. The woman seemed attentive. They looked, he said, like a couple who had been together long enough to be comfortable in each other's silence. He had no reason to think otherwise. Nobody did. At 11:14 a.m. Zayed al-Rashidi arrived at the Qasr al-Bahar. He checked in under the name of a Pakistani trade consultant, a name attached to a passport that was later confirmed by UAE Border Security Forensics to be fraudulent, manufactured through a document service operating out of a third country, linked through financial tracing to a holding company nested inside the Rashidi family's broader asset network through 3 layers of registration in 2 jurisdictions. The chain took investigators 36 hours to fully unravel. The passport itself, examined by the hotel's check-in system, had cleared without flag. It was a good forgery. Zayed had paid accordingly. Room 2914, 29th floor. 2 floors directly below room 3112. He had not communicated with Natasha through any traceable channel in 6 days. The communication blackout was deliberate, planned weeks in advance, and maintained with the discipline of someone who understood that the period immediately surrounding the event was the period of maximum forensic exposure, and that any message sent in those 6 days would survive on a server somewhere regardless of what either of them deleted from their own devices. 6 days of silence. 6 days in which Natasha was alone in room 3112 with a husband who knew everything and said nothing, and Zayed was moving through the preparatory steps of a plan he had been building for 14 months, and the distance between where they were and where the plan required them to be was closing with the momentum of something that had long passed the point where stopping it was a choice either of them could cleanly make. At 10:15 p.m., the corridor cameras between floors 29 and 32 went offline. The hotel's system log recorded this as a technical fault, a designation that the head of IT security would spend an uncomfortable 40 minutes defending to Detective Al-Muhari before ultimately conceding that the fault was not spontaneous. The camera system had been accessed remotely using credentials belonging to an IT subcontractor employed by the hotel's primary security vendor, a 28-year-old man named in the investigation record who gave 3 different accounts of what had happened before settling on the truth, which was that he had received 20,000 dirhams in cash deposited to his personal account 4 days before November 3rd, and in exchange he had provided his access credentials to a contact he could not fully identify and had made himself unavailable that night and had not asked any questions because the 20,000 dirhams was more than he earned in 6 weeks, and the request had been framed as a routine security test that someone senior had authorized and that he would get in trouble for knowing about if he mentioned it. He understood, once investigators sat him down, that none of that was going to help him. He confirmed everything. Zayed had identified the main camera network. He had found the access point. He had paid for a blind spot that covered the corridors between his floor and Hamad's. Every route between rooms 2914 and 3112, every hallway camera, every stairwell camera, was dark from 10:15 p.m. onward. He had not thought about Elevator 4. Elevator 4 was one of 8 elevator cars serving the Qasr Al-Bahar's residential tower floors. It ran on a separate closed-circuit recording system, a backup unit installed during a comprehensive security infrastructure upgrade in 2019, added at the specific recommendation of the hotel's then security director, following an incident review that identified the primary network's single point of failure as a vulnerability. The backup system was managed by a different contractor from the primary network. Its footage was not stored on the hotel's main server. It was stored locally, on a hard drive mounted inside the elevator shaft housing at subbasement level, accessible only by physically opening the housing panel. It was not connected to the main surveillance network in any way, could not be accessed remotely. It did not appear on any diagram of the hotel's security infrastructure that was accessible to anyone who did not work directly on its installation or maintenance. Zayed had researched the hotel's camera system extensively. He had found the primary network, identified the subcontractor, purchased the blind spot. He had not found the backup system because the backup system was not on any document he could access. It existed in a maintenance log filed by a contractor who had completed the installation in October 2019 and submitted his paperwork to the hotel's facilities management department, where it had been correctly archived and never subsequently reviewed by anyone in the security team because the backup system had never malfunctioned and had therefore never required attention. He had planned a perfect night with one invisible witness. At 11:31 p.m., Natasha left room 3112. She told Hamad she was going to the late lounge for a drink. She picked up her room key and her small evening bag and she walked to the door. What happened in the moment between her saying that and the door closing, whether Hamad said anything, whether he looked at her in a way that communicated what he knew, whether there was a pause or a silence or something that passed between them that she would later spend considerable time in an interrogation room trying to describe, is not captured on any recording. The room had no camera. The corridor cameras between floors 29 and 32 were offline. What happened in room 3112 between 11:31 p.m. and 12:44 a.m. exists only in what the physical evidence implied and what Natasha's partial testimony eventually offered, and those two sources did not produce a complete picture. What is captured, completely, in high-resolution footage stored on a hard drive inside a maintenance housing at sub-basement level, begins at 11:47 p.m. Elevator 4, 31st floor. The doors open and Natasha steps in and Zayed is already there. He had come up from the 29th floor and was waiting. He had timed it from her message, sent 6 days into their communication blackout through a method investigators later identified as a prearranged signal using a hotel amenity request logged to his room number, a code they had established before the blackout began. She had sent the signal at 11:28 p.m. He had been in the elevator for 4 minutes before the doors opened on her floor. The camera sees everything. He stands close, not threatening, intimate, the body language of shared history rather than coercion, the specific proximity of two people who have been meeting in private for over a year and have developed between them the physical grammar of a real relationship, whatever else it was built on top of. He speaks to her. The forensic audio analyst brought in after investigators identified the footage as material worked with the recording for 11 hours using enhancement software designed for exactly this, recovering voice from ambient mechanical noise in enclosed spaces. The elevator shaft hum was consistent. The voices were low. The recovery was partial but sufficient. His voice, recovered at approximately 60% clarity. He hasn't signed. His lawyer called my father's office this morning asking about the arbitration clause. He knows something. If he wakes up tomorrow and calls that lawyer, the whole thing collapses. Everything. Tonight is the only night. You go back up there and you open that balcony and you make it happen. If you don't, I go to him. I tell him everything. You go to prison and I walk away clean. The camera records 4 seconds of silence. Not the silence of shock. Not the wide-eyed stillness of someone hearing something for the first time. The silence of someone who had been told there would be more time and had just been told there was not, standing in an elevator at 11:47 p.m. on the third night of her honeymoon, calculating something in real time that she had been calculating in the abstract for 14 months. For seconds. The analyst noted in her report that Natasha's body language during those 4 seconds showed no visible startle response. No physical recoil. The information was not new information. The timeline was what was new. Her voice, recovered at higher clarity because she spoke more directly toward the camera's audio pickup. And after, his answer was immediate. No pause. He had prepared this answer. After you are a widow with 340 million dirhams and I am your business advisor and we never have to speak about this night again. The elevator reached the 29th floor. The doors opened. They walked into the corridor that was dark on the main network, invisible to the system that Zayed had paid to disable, and they were inside his room for 41 minutes. The elevator camera recorded the empty car for 41 minutes. The hard drive kept running. No one in the hotel knew it was there. No one in room 3112 knew it was there. Zayed did not know it was there. At 12:28 a.m., Natasha stepped back into elevator 4 alone. The doors closed. The car began moving upward, toward the 31st floor. The camera recorded her face for the duration of the ascent, and the forensic analyst who had spent 11 hours enhancing the audio spent considerably less time on this section because there was nothing to enhance. There was only an image. A woman standing in an elevator at 12:28 a.m. staring at the doors that had not yet opened, hands at her sides, completely still. The woman who had laughed on the way down, who had let him touch her face, who had allowed the intimacy of proximity, who had been in that room for 41 minutes, was not the woman on the way back up. The face on the return journey was the face of someone on the other side of a decision. Not grief, not fear. Something colder and more settled than either of those things. Something that had resolved. Detective Al-Muhari watched this section of the footage 7 times before she said a single word to her team. At 12:44 a.m. Hamad Al-Suwaidi went over the balcony of room 3112. At 12:51 a.m. a hotel security guard, conducting a scheduled perimeter check of the lower terrace levels, found him. At 12:53 a.m. emergency services were contacted. At 1:09 a.m. Hamad Al-Suwaidi was pronounced dead at the scene. The initial assessment from Dubai police arrived at the same conclusion that the hotel's head of security had arrived at within the first hour and that the responding paramedics had noted in their preliminary report. Accidental death. A healthy man on his honeymoon. A balcony. No witnesses. No evidence of physical struggle inside the room. The room was clean, the furniture undisturbed, no defensive injuries on the body, no foreign DNA under the fingernails, no bruising inconsistent with the fall itself. Natasha was brought downstairs and interviewed within 2 hours. She was distraught. She was cooperative. She gave her statement clearly and consistently. She had gone to the lounge for a drink, she had come back, the balcony door was open, he was gone. She had no explanation. She had no idea. The case was moving toward closure within 48 hours. The file was being organized. The documentation for an accidental death classification was being prepared. And then, on the morning of November 4th, a hotel maintenance technician showed up at sub-basement level to perform scheduled service on Elevator 4's mechanical housing. The work order had been logged 2 weeks earlier. Routine. He opened the housing panel and reached for the drive unit and found that the local recording hard drive was full, filled to capacity, recording continuously without the footage ever being cleared, which meant the maintenance oversight of not clearing it had gone unnoticed for 11 days. He flagged it to his supervisor as a procedural note. His supervisor pulled the drive and took it to the hotel's head of security as a matter of standard protocol. The head of security loaded the drive. He watched 47 minutes of footage from the night of November 3rd. He called Dubai police at 6:15 a.m. Detective Aisha Al-Muhari was assigned the case at 9:47 a.m. on November 4th. She was 43 years old. 12 years in Dubai police, the first 4 in financial crimes and the last 8 in homicide. She was known in her department for 2 things: She did not form a theory before she had watched all available footage herself, and she did not share her conclusions until she was certain they would hold. She had a reputation for silence in the early stages of an investigation that her colleagues had learned to interpret correctly, not absence of progress, but the specific quality of concentration that precedes certainty. She did not perform her thinking. She did it. She watched Elevator 4's footage 7 times before she said a single word to her team. She watched Natasha's face on the way down. She watched Zayed's mouth moving. She watched the 4 seconds of silence. She watched Natasha's face on the way back up. She watched all of it 7 times, and then she turned to the room and said 3 sentences. Pull every camera in the building for the full 72 hours preceding the death. Find out who is registered in every room on floors 27 through 32. And get me the hotel's full contractor list for security and maintenance going back 18 months. What the building's cameras produced over the next 6 hours was a map of Zayed al-Rashidi's movements across 2 days that he had believed were invisible. He appeared on 6 separate cameras in public areas of the hotel: the lobby, a ground floor corridor, a service elevator vestibule on the 28th floor. A guest with no legitimate reason to be present between floors 27 and 32. A room booked under a name that took her team 36 hours to trace back to a fraudulent passport, and the passport to a holding company, and the holding company through 3 registration layers to the Rashidi family's asset network. The financial forensics analyst who completed that trace described it later as a chain that was designed to take months to unravel and had been built by someone who understood corporate structure well enough to construct genuine-looking opacity. It had taken 36 hours because her team was good. Under the circumstances that would have existed if Elevator 4 had not been running, nobody would ever have known where to start looking. The disabled corridor cameras produced the IT subcontractor. The subcontractor produced the 20,000 dirham deposit. The deposit produced a confession within a single interview session. He confirmed the access credentials, the request, the cache, the instruction to be unavailable. He confirmed the date. He confirmed that he had not known what the access would be used for, and Detective Al-Mahari noted in her report that she believed him on that specific point, which is why he was charged as an accessory rather than a co-conspirator. Natasha was arrested on day 3. She was brought into an interview room and she maintained her story, the lounge, the drink, the open balcony, she didn't know, for 6 hours. Then the audio from Elevator 4 was played to her. Not summarized, not described. Played. The ambient hum of the elevator shaft. Zayed's voice at 60% clarity. The 4-second silence. Her own voice asking and after. His answer. She listened to all of it without changing her expression, and then she asked for a different lawyer and said nothing further for the remainder of that session. Zayed was arrested on day 4 at Dubai International Airport. Gate B24. A flight to London. Boarding in 11 minutes when security identified him from the passenger manifest and pulled him from the queue. His carry-on luggage was searched at the gate. In a false-bottom toiletry case, investigators found a prepaid SIM card, unused, purchased for a contingency that had not been needed, and a handwritten note with 2 numbers. A Cayman Islands bank account. A phone number registered to a call forwarding service based in Cyprus. Both numbers were traced within 18 hours to the same shell company. The same company that had wired 400,000 euros to a Lithuanian account in Natasha's maiden name 7 days before she walked into the charity gala and made a 54-year-old man feel chosen for the first time in 3 years. Zayed did not speak during the arrest. He did not speak during transport. He asked for his lawyer's contact number and was told he could make a call from the facility. He looked, the arresting officer noted, like a man who had prepared for this possibility, and had decided in advance how he would behave when it arrived. Controlled, already managing the next phase. On November 6th, 3 days after Hamad's death, 2 days before the automatic trigger would have released it regardless, Khalid Baser walked into the Dubai Public Prosecution Office at 9:15 a.m. carrying a sealed envelope and a notarized letter of instruction that explained what the envelope contained and under what conditions it had been prepared and by whom. He had received no call from Hamad at 8 a.m. on November 4th. He had sat at his desk from 7:55 a.m. watching the clock move past 8 o'clock and then past 8:01 and then past 8:15, and at some point in that window, he had understood with complete certainty what the silence meant. and he had sat with it for a long time before he picked up the envelope and his coat and walked to his car. Later, when asked by investigators to describe how he had felt in those minutes, Khalid said he had felt the specific weight of a thing he had hoped would not be necessary becoming necessary, and that the weight of that was different from grief and different from surprise because he had known Hamad well enough to understand, when the man had asked him to prepare the document rather than going directly to the police, that Hamad was not certain he was coming back. He had built the envelope for the version of events where he didn't. Khalid had built it with him. Sitting at that desk at 8:15 a.m., he understood that they had built it correctly. The envelope contained everything. The matchmaking network documentation, the payment records, the €400,000 preparation transfer, the transaction trail to the Cayman Shell Company, the full financial architecture of a plan that had moved real money across 4 jurisdictions. The coaching messages, all 211 of them, printed and indexed by date. The Kiev photograph with the metadata timestamp. The gray folder complete. And at the back, separated by a single plane divider, the 2:34 a.m. message and Natasha's reply and Zayed's 5 words. Notarized by a Dubai legal notary on October 31st. 3 days before they flew to Dubai. Signed by Hamad al-Suwaidi and witnessed by Khalid Baser and dated with the specificity of a man who understood that dates, in legal documents, were the difference between evidence and hearsay. Detective al-Muhari read the contents in her office with the door closed. When she came out, she told her team one thing. He knew. He went anyway. He gave us everything. Natasha broke on day 6. Not because of the elevator audio. She had heard it and spent 3 days constructing a response to it that her new lawyer had shaped into a coercion narrative. Zayed had threatened her, cornered her, left her no exit. She was as much his victim as Hamad was. It was not an implausible argument in the abstract. There were elements of the truth inside it. The prosecution knew this and had been preparing for it from the moment the elevator recording was processed. What broke Natasha was not the audio. It was the envelope. Detective al-Muhari placed it on the table in front of her on the morning of day 6. Not the contents, the envelope itself, sealed and notarized and dated, and told her what it was. That her husband had found out about Zayed 3 weeks before the honeymoon. That he had built this document himself with his own lawyer before they flew to Dubai. That he had known who she was before he boarded the plane. That he had gone anyway. Natasha stared at the envelope for a long time without speaking. Then she asked the question that the prosecution's forensic psychologist would later describe as the most revealing moment in the entire 6-day interrogation sequence. More revealing than any admission, more revealing than the elevator footage, because it was the question of a woman who had spent 6 days managing her exposure and had suddenly stopped managing and started needing to know something. Did he know on the night? When I came back to the room, did he know what I was going to do? Al-Muhari said nothing. She had learned over 8 years in homicide that silence in an interrogation room, applied at the correct moment, produced more than any question. Natasha looked at the envelope on the table. She looked at it for a long time. And then she said the sentence that the prosecution would play at the opening of every court session for the duration of the trial. Not because it was a legal admission, though it was, but because it contained something that no legal language could have produced on its own. The truth of a specific moment, witnessed by one person who was gone and one person who remained and would have to carry it. He looked at me when I came back in. He was standing by the window, not the balcony, the window. He looked at me and he didn't say anything. He just looked. And I thought he was about to say something. And then he walked to the balcony and She stopped. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Zayed al-Rashidi was charged with premeditated murder, criminal conspiracy, bribery, and document fraud. He maintained his silence through 7 weeks of proceedings with the discipline of a man who had decided before his arrest that the only viable strategy was to give the prosecution nothing additional to work with, that everything they had was already everything they were going to get, and that his lawyers would find the edges of it. His lawyers did not find the edges of it. The edges of it had been sealed in an envelope by the man he had killed, notarized and dated 3 days before the death, and there were no edges. Natasha's defense argued coercion throughout. They played the elevator audio and pointed to the threat, "You go to prison and I walk away clean," and they argued that a woman alone in a foreign country with a fraudulent employment history and a payment trail that already implicated her, faced with that threat at 11:47 p.m. in an elevator, had made the only choice she believed was available. The prosecution played the €400,000 transfer. They read out the coaching messages. They placed the key of dinner in front of the jury 14 months before the threat in the elevator and asked them to consider whether a coerced person accepts preparation money before the first meeting, spends 8 months being coached, and stands in an elevator for 4 seconds of recorded silence before asking and after with the specificity of someone negotiating the exit terms of a business arrangement. The jury considered it. Tariq al-Rashidi was not charged. The investigation found no direct documentary evidence connecting him to the plan. No messages, no payments, no communication that placed him in knowledge of what his son had built. Whether he knew, whether he suspected, whether the silence he maintained after his son's arrest was the silence of ignorance or the silence of a man who understood that speaking could only make things worse, was a question the investigation could not answer to the standard required for prosecution. He resigned from the company voluntarily 2 weeks after Zayed's arrest. He has not spoken publicly. He has not, according to the facility's visitor records, visited his son in detention. Hamad's estate, 340 million dirhams, sits in legal trust. Under UAE law, a spouse convicted of a partner's murder cannot inherit. Without a surviving eligible spouse and without children, the estate reverts to extended family. Hamad had no siblings. His closest living relative is a cousin in Sharjah he had not spoken to in 12 years. The legal proceedings are expected to last years. The 1,200 people who built freight routes and loaded containers and drove logistics across the Gulf in the company Hamad assembled from a single container lease in 1996 are waiting for a resolution that moves at the speed of inheritance courts. The restructuring documents were never signed. They sit in a legal file in a Dubai law firm that is billing the estate for storage. The Qasr al-Bahar removed balcony access from room 3112 following the investigation. The room has been redecorated. It is available for booking. The hotel does not mention what happened there. Guests who stay in it look out at the Gulf from a window that does not open onto the view it once did, and they do not know why, and the staff do not tell them. Occasionally someone asks about the view from that floor. The staff say it is the best in Dubai. On a clear November night from the 31st floor you can see the entire city laid out below. The lights of the marina, the geometry of downtown, the dark water of the Gulf stretching to the horizon. You can see everything a man might have built over 30 years and looked out at from a high place and understood was real. Hamad al-Suwaidi went to that balcony knowing what was waiting for him. He had spent his entire life going toward things directly rather than managing them from a safe distance. He had built everything he had ever owned by refusing to retreat. The gray folder was the last thing he built, and he built it with the same precision he had brought to every freight contract and every arbitration and every decision that had taken him from 85,000 dirhams and a single container to 340 million dirhams and a name that appeared in Gulf business publications as an example of what was possible when a man trusted only what he could verify. He had verified everything. He had gone to Dubai. He had left behind an envelope that made sure the people who took everything from him would never spend a day of it free. That was the last thing he built. It was enough.